As I mentioned before, I'm Melissa Camara. We're doing this hopefully once a month. I would like to on Tuesdays talk about the latest wildfire science. And we're going to, as I said, talk about grazing to reduce blazing. And so I'm just going to go here with our staff that we have on the call. We've got my colleague, Dr. Clay Trauernicht with the University of Hawaii. I'm sorry, Clay, I'm just going straight to your bio on the webpage. So
It
that
might
he
be, it might be too much.
well, it's just quickly to say that you're University of Hawaii faculty, and please tell us a little bit more when I hand it over to you. But clay has so many specialties: fire, wildfire, ecosystems, endangered species, so many different areas. But today we're going to talk about wildfire and animals and how to reduce that wildfire impact. And then we also have Dr. Mark Thorne, who's also faculty with University of Hawaii. He's extension, and his specialty is state range and livestock extension specialist. So he really knows all the ins and outs on how to raise animals, how to manage animals, how to just do really important work of animal husbandry. He'll talk a bit about that. So I'm super excited to have both of you, all of us here on this call today. And so we are going to turn it over to Clay shortly, and then Mark. And then finally, we will have this question and answer and open discussion in which I will ask all of you, if you don't mind, to later to unmute yourselves. But for now, let's turn it over to Clay.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. So I'm Clay Trauernicht and University of Hawaii faculty. I know a bunch of folks on the that have signed in today, so welcome everybody. Yeah, as Melissa was saying, I have done a lot of stuff on fire the past 10 years or so, and more recently kind of switching to work more closely on ecosystem conservation and restoration. So I'm kind of doing fire in addition to a lot of other stuff. But it's kind of an interesting intersection between grazing management and conservation, because there's been a lot of pushback, I think, in the conservation community. It's safe to say, just given sort of some of the historical impacts that ungulates have had. And of course, reducing the impact of wild ungulates on native ecosystems is a big task for folks working in watershed management. And so it's been really encouraging, though, I think, over the past 5 to 10 years, actually, just to see a shift amongst those folks, at least, to thinking that, oh, fire is posing this threat, and we know that animals provide a tool, right? So trying to, I think, shifting gears into thinking about how to use animals and seeing the benefit basically of grazing. And so that being said, I think there's a lot for them to learn, for me, myself as well. So I also have enjoyed working and learning from Mark Thorne over the years too, because really it kind of brings together the side of watershed management with a really powerful tool for managing fuels at large scales. And that's really the problem that we're dealing with in Hawaii. So just, I think a lot of you know through the work of Pacific Fire Exchange and Hawaii Wildfire that the fire problem in Hawaii is tied to grass, and much more explicitly than that, it's tied to our sort of abandonment of large-scale agricultural practices. So you've seen a 60% reduction in the footprint of plantation agriculture, as well as grazing, right? So like the actual extent of lands that are under active grazing has been shrinking pretty precipitously since the 1960s about. And so as that footprint shrinks, it's not like all of those lands just become reforested, right? They pretty much revert to unmanaged grasslands and shrublands. And that's really what drives fire risk across the state, right? So we see Central Maui is the classic example. Sugarcane goes out of production in 2016, and we're like sitting there, it's going to happen. And sure enough, 2019, they had about 25,000 acres burned across Central Maui, right? And so what I think we are not really linking these things directly until the fire happens, but that change in land use puts an incredible burden on firefighters, and it kind of increases the I guess, vulnerability, right, of the watershed. So those resources that were kind of worrying about that are more Malca, it impacts those. When we have these fires burn into those forest edges, those forests don't really recover. So all that to say, we got to talk about science. I know that's Melissa's kind of goal here today. We have really good evidence, and I think Mark could speak to this probably a lot more eloquently than I can, but there's really solid evidence that grazing, targeted grazing, can reduce fuel loads and can reduce fuel continuity. There's other evidence that it also actually increases the amount of green, the sort of fuel moisture in those fuels, because the cows are constantly removing the grass as it comes in. And so you actually have less standing dead material. And it's that quantity of standing dead material that really drives fire behavior, right? That's what kind of promotes the spread and how fast and how hot fires are burning. So anything that we can think about as far as reducing how connected those fuels are over the landscape and how much fuel is out there, we need to be thinking about. And I think, talk about this, like we have about 1 million acres of grassland statewide, and we're not hitting that with weed whackers, right? Like it's sort of to think about this as a really critical tool to manage large scale landscapes, and also to just kind of recognize the knowledge that grazers have, right? And that Mark and folks that work with grazing bring. I mean, this is it's an ecological science behind this. There's a ton of traditional knowledge like embedded in that, in the heads of the folks that have actually been doing this for decades. And so there's right ways and wrong ways to do it, and I'm going to let Mark talk about that a little bit more. The only other thing I'd want to add is we had one more, the most recent science piece of research that kind of, I think we can bring to bear. So multiple studies kind of showing these effects. You use animals, you're going to reduce the fuels, and then we kind of can model fire behavior. So we get the reductions in fire intensity, reductions in how quickly the rate of spread, how quickly fires move across the landscape, and most importantly, reductions in fire intensity, right? So how hot are things burning? And then the newest piece of research, or kind of evidence to put on the floor here that folks have been wondering about, is what about the feral ungulates, right? And so when you look towards the grazing literature tied to fire management on the mainland, everybody's basically saying it has to be targeted. You can't just have like random animals roaming around and you're going to achieve those goals. And we finally have some evidence for that from Hawaii. I had a student that did some work where he paired plots in fenced units and unfenced units. So basically just having sampling fuels in unfenced areas right adjacent to where they've done ungulate removal. And what he found was that you do get an effect. So there's lower fuel loads for some of these areas that have wild ungulates, but that affects the ability of those wild ungulates to reduce fuel loads dramatically decreases as your rainfall goes down. So in other words, it doesn't work well for these drier areas, right? It kind of only happens when you have these wetter upper elevation conditions. And so that being said, that effect is much reduced in the areas where fire risk is highest, right? So it's pretty convincing from Hawaii that, we can't just rely on wild ungulates to get this kind of work done, to get the results that we want to see. And then I had another note here just about spreading weeds. And there's this kind of feedback between, and also conception or perception of weeds in the landscape. If you're coming at this from a grazing management perspective, right, what we would call weeds coming from upland native ecosystem perspective, this is forage, right? And so we can kind of look at the distribution of these grasses and the purpose that they serve, right? And I think that no one who's doing weed management in a watershed is going to put out there that we're going to remove these things across the whole landscape, right? It was like, we're kind of beyond that. We sort of have inherited these large scale grasslands, right? And so the idea of converting those to another kind of vegetation type is also a strategy that we could talk about. This is like through forest restoration, because there are limitations to the effectiveness of grazing. And I think maybe I'll end it on that. We kind of saw that with the Mono Road fire, where they burned through a bunch of areas. So this is the big 40,000 acre fire that happened last year. I think it's just last year, right? I'm kind of mixing up things still with COVID. I think it was just last year. And it ripped through a lot of grazed pastures and on Parker Ranch. And so, but recognizing that that's under really extreme conditions of wind and drought. But, we also want to be thinking about, kind of under normal circumstances. So when do we accrue these benefits, and when might they kind of be limited as far as their effects? And we have to kind of be ready to respond to these extreme conditions. So, but even fuel breaks, I just add this, even fuel breaks, I think the classic example again comes from Maui in 2019, where that Waiko road fire, it jumped 6-lane highway, right? So we're always going to be seeing these conditions in which some of these fuel management strategies aren't going to be effective. But the bottom line is, I think that they can be used as a tool ultimately to create safer conditions for the firefighters who are going to be responding to these incidents. And that was less than 10 minutes, Melissa.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Clay. That was a rapid, painting the picture of what the tool is, why we should want to use it. And let's hand it over then to Mark. We want to hear the how-tos and your other knowledge that you have for us.
Okay, well, thank you, Melissa and Clay. As Melissa said, I'm Mark Thorne. I'm the Range and Livestock Extension Specialist with the University of Hawaii. I'm also on the board of directors for the Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, and have been for just about 20 years now, both at the university and with Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization. So I'm first and foremost a grazing or a rangeland ecologist. So I'm concerned with the ecology of rangelands and grazing lands, and how we use livestock to manage those landscapes. And so, when it comes to planning or targeted grazing for fire fuels management, I think the first thing that is important to point out is that it requires active management. It requires planning. And I think that that's the biggest contrast between using livestock, domestic livestock, in a targeted grazing management program for fire fuels management, rather than, say, wildlife or wild ungulates. The wild ungulates are unpredictable. You can't control them. So just as Clay pointed out, they're going to stay in those wettest climates because that's where the best forage is, and they're going to avoid those drier areas because, well, nobody's making them utilize those areas. So we can put livestock where we want them, and but it's more than just putting animals out there. You can't just put a bunch of cows someplace. You can't just put a bunch of goats or sheep someplace and expect them to give you the impact that you want without planning and without management. So, I think those are the first two key components, is that it has to be planned and then it has to be managed. And, when we're planning these things, it's a matter of looking at, and I may slip over into this language where I talk about forage availability, but at the same time I'm talking about forage availability, we're actually talking about fuel loads from a fire's perspective. But if you're asking livestock to consume something for the sake of fire fuel management, you're actually asking them to get their total nutritional value from that pasture or field or wherever you're grazing them at. So to them, it's a forage, and then we have to be concerned about the quality of that forage. Is it sufficient in terms of protein and energy and vitamins and nutrients to support their daily needs? Is there a sufficient amount in there to meet their energy needs? And so it depends on the type of animal that we're grazing. If it's a cow, we calculate that she needs 2.6% of her body weight on a dry matter basis every day. And if that is not sufficient, then she's going to starve, as an example. So there's ways of calculating what that stocking rate would be. And if we understand what those daily demands are, then we can set the grazing limit. So we can determine when we want to move those animals out, when we've reached that desirable reduction in the fuel load or the desirable utilization level of the pasture. And So those things become extremely important. And from a livestock standpoint, we typically think about removing only 50% of the standing biomass. And mainly that is not an animal related issue, but more of a plant related issue. And there's been a lot of research out there that has shown that grazing pressure that is greater than 50% of the standing biomass actually reduces the root mass of the plants. And it's pretty dramatic. At 50%, there's no loss in root mass production in the plant. But at 60%, you lose almost 50% of the root mass of the plant. So that's quite a threshold. And if you start to continually pressure that plant and reduce its ability to maintain and establish a root mass, it'll eventually die. And part of that has to do with its ability to photosynthesize. So if we only take 50% of that standing biomass, and that's not just a linear measure, that's actually by weight. I should point that out, but that's by weight. And but leaving that 50% allows the plant to photosynthesize, continue to capture carbohydrates, replenish root masses, roots that turn over just out of natural turnover, and maintain functionality. So I think that's another aspect that we have to be concerned with in terms of using grazing in these areas. So you have to determine what those goals are going to be. If you're trying to maintain a system where you can continually use grazing as a tool, then you're going to need to not overgraze that on a consistent basis, or you're going to lose those grasses that will actually support those livestock. So, but what if the point is not to have that grass base there? You want to transition it into something else. Well, I think that you've got to be really careful. And so if you continually overgraze, the alternative is that we're gonna grow a lot of weeds. And in the 20 years that I've been here, anywhere that's overgrazed, anywhere that you remove the grass cover, you get this tremendous load of and diversity of weeds that come in, and they're really hard to control. They're really hard to manage, and it's really expensive to manage them. It takes lots of chemicals. It takes a lot of pressure. It takes a lot of effort to bring those landscapes back into something that's functional when you've allowed them to convert into a weed patch. And so I think from a landscape view, I think our goals are to slowly transition. If we're trying to transition something into a native forest, or a forest with native species in it, then I think we work carefully and we work consistently to do that. On the other hand, if we're in an area that it's we're going to try to maintain the forage base and just maintain livestock grazing, then I think the objectives change just a little bit, and we've got to be careful. We still have to remain careful about that. So I think a couple points to really emphasize is that when we're using livestock for grazing in a fire fuels management perspective, we still have to be concerned about the health and well-being of those animals. As managers, that's what we're responsible for. These are living animals. We have to make sure that those animals maintain their health and condition. We also want to make sure that the system maintains its health and condition. We don't want to increase the weed composition of those pastures. We don't want to encourage wind and water erosion out of those systems. So we have to plan and utilize those management perspectives properly. So I think I think there's a lot of room for for research out there in terms of how much utilization we have to employ to reduce the amount of fuel load to a safe level for firefighters in the case of a fire. There has been some research out there. I think that Melissa has put out some links to various research components that have been done. And I just to point out a couple things. So, grazing, I think, is absolutely a tool that could be used in conjunction with other types of management protocols. I think, again, I think that there are concerns and considerations that have to be made. Clay and I completed some work back in 2016. We had an opportunity to work with a local ranch and the U.S. Army to do some pre-grazing and post-grazing analysis of forage, the fuel loads and of an area. It was quite interesting to see how much reduction we had in terms of just getting a little bit of grazing pressure into those areas. Just to kind of really summarize it quickly, we established some transects and we established some exclosures across this 350-acre pasture. And we took some pre-grazing analysis of the forage. We looked at live biomass, we looked at standing biomass, dead biomass, and we looked at litter. We looked at, and then we did this at the end of the grazing cycle as well. And then we looked at pre-graze, 45-day graze, and then post-graze on the exclosures. And then Parker Ranch came in. The ranch came in and grazed about 250 head of cattle on this, 230 head of cattle, I guess it was, on this 350 acres for about 70 days. And we got about a 70% or a 30% reduction, 30% reduction on the live standing biomass. I think we had about a little over 25% reduction in the standing dead material and a 17% reduction in the litter across that grazing period. And, with just that little bit of reduction, for example, at 30% of that standing live material, we were able, and then Clay used some models, behave models, to determine various aspects of the rate of spread of fire in that area, pre-graze versus post-graze. And so we went from, looking at different wind and fuel moisture models. We went from a range of 12 to 6 chains per hour as a rate of spread down to less than about 1 chain per hour. At all fuel moistures and at all wind speeds. So that's a pretty substantial decrease in the rate of spread of a fire. And now just think about being a firefighter out there and trying to fight something that hasn't been grazed in 5 years, and you're chasing a fire that's running at 12 chains per hour. That's pretty scary. That's a pretty volatile fire event. I think they would all much rather fight a fire that's moving at about 1 chain per hour. And so, I think that's the value of using grazing and getting grazing into an area, is that, you're not going to stop the fires. Fires are going to happen. Ignitions are going to happen. But if you can have it moving at 1 chain per hour versus 12 or 6 or whatever, I mean, that increases the safety for the firefighters, increases the safety for the communities, and everybody involved. And so, and plus it doesn't burn as hot, so it doesn't affect the environment as well as intensely. These very hot, fast moving fires can be pretty devastating to the soils and to the organic matter in the soils and those kinds of things. So there's conservation aspect to all of this as well. So I think that's, I think there's some research that needs to be done, and it would be good if in the future, and Clay and I have worked on trying to do more of this kind of research there, but the funding has been a little bit tight, a little bit hard to get to, but you know, those are the kinds of things I think we need to be looking at is, you know, how to employ the grazing. You know, it's not, and the one final point I guess I would want to make is that, and I think was important for the research side, is that it's not a one-time implementation. You know, the grass is going to grow back. And so because it's going to grow back, you're going to have to come back in with the grazing. So I think big questions out there are, you know, what are the return intervals that need to happen for grazing to keep those fuel loads at a level of which is acceptable for firefighting? And I think that's a big question, right? And so, you know, and a lot of that depends on, you know, precipitation and the growth curves of the grasses that are in those areas. And it can vary. I apologize about the phone ringing, folks. I can't do anything about it. But you know, so the return interval, you know, how much time can you be away from there from grazing? How much time, you know, how frequently did those grazing animals have to be there? So I'm gonna end it there and just open it up for any questions.
Thank you so much, Mark and Clay. Oh gosh, I have so many questions. I don't want to hog the time here, but um, you know, the former natural resource manager myself, you know, and this wasn't a tool when I was doing it, or wasn't widely available as a tool when I was thinking about, you know, native systems, you know, and protecting those native systems. I wonder, Mark, you know, and Clay, if you are managing for native ecosystems up way up Malka, for example, like where is the best place to maybe think about this tool? That's the first part. And then, you know, if you're just an, you know, your average homeowner, renter, or whatever, and you know, you have like your 1 acre or your half acre, like what's feasible, you know, in terms of numbers of animals and effort and cost. And I know those are two super big questions. So I mean, maybe just pick an example of something that you might think of for both.
Well, I could take the first real quick and maybe pass the second to Mark. That sounds like a harder question anyway. But like, first of all, you know, you have to do it in places that the forage is adequate. And I think just to make the case, in the sense of these like watershed management problems, like typically, I mean, there are exceptions to this, but typically what you're looking at is kind of encroachment of fire from down below. Big Island and Maui have some scenarios where it's actually coming from above, where you've got kind of that upper elevation grasslands. But typically it's kind of encroaching into that forest. And so a lot of times from like where it's a watershed management problem or issue, they're looking to partner with folks or, you know, help how they can support communities and landowners down below. So the classic example that Mark and I have been helping with over the years is at Waianae, where they have the forest reserve and it's right up against a grazing lease, right? And so what are the best ways or better ways in which we can kind of help those landowners effectively graze along that perimeter? And when we talk about like the fires impacts on the forest reserve, it's more of this like encroachment, you know, of over successive fires. You know, the exceptions might be some sorts of West Maui, like Ma'alaya, for example, where it just runs up the whole mountainside these days. But you know, that is also the product of successive fires over the years, right? Kind of pushing that forest line Malka. And in some instances, like I said, in the Big Island, kind of pushing it actually down from above. But yeah, and I think the numbers game, which is kind of that second part of your question, I might pass to Mark, because that is you know, difficult and depends on the context.
Yeah, I would, you know, I agree with Clay. I think for these natural areas, these conservation areas that are already forested and everything, I think you're looking at, you know, grazing along boundaries, just to prevent the, you know, the fires typically are going to spread from, you know, from the grassland into the forest. It's not likely that, it's less likely that the ignitions are going to happen within the forest. And you know, the farther into the forest that you get, the less likely the fires are going to carry, just because of the, you know, the fuel moisture and the shading and a lot of other factors that are going to affect the fire. But if you could prevent them from, you know, the fires, as Clay pointed out, encroaching up into that, then, you know, as they encroach one time, they're going to burn a little farther in, and eventually you start to lose the forest from all of that. So if you could graze around those boundaries or those borders, creating sort of a fuel break, if you will, with grazing, I think you're ahead of the game. The numbers, when you start thinking about how many animals and what makes it feasible, it really depends on the forage. I mean, it comes back to that grazing planning, right? I mean, you have to be able to balance the number of animals that you're grazing with the fuel, with the forage available that's there, and what your fuel load management objectives are. And so, if you now to back down, you gave the example of somebody with an acre. I wouldn't necessarily recommend anybody with an acre of ground, going out and investing in, say, a goat or a sheep or a cow simply because they want to graze their 1 acre, if they haven't raised animals in the past. And, because, as much as I'm saying this is an important tool, it's also a significant responsibility to take care of those animals, right? And it's not easy. It's not to say that it shouldn't be there, but people that are doing grazings, people that raise livestock, are already involved in it. They already have the skill set and the knowledge. Animals get sick, they get parasites. You need to provide them with the right kind of minerals and vitamins and nutrients, and the forage has got to be there. The water has to be there. The fence lines have to be maintained. And there's predators and there's humans involvement that are threatening those animals, and so you've got to be there to manage them, and you got to be there to pay attention. And so all of those things are challenges that I think have to be brought into concern and consideration for folks. So again, if anybody just having an acre of ground, I wouldn't just say, go get a goat and it'll solve all your problems, because it won't. It'll create more problems. It'll create more challenges for them. Now, they may just love it and jump right into it, and and everything, and that would be fine for them. But they have to weigh that. They have to get that knowledge and gain that knowledge. But as you increase in size and the acreage, I think that given depending on where your location is at and what you boundary and what you border, the effectiveness of that grazing is going to change. And so if you're on the boundary of a place where there isn't any grazing and it's all grassland, and then I think grazing can be a consistent tool to protect your own area, right? And if you want to employ grazing and animals to graze those fuel loads to protect you from a fire that might burn into your landscape or area, I think that's a viable option for somebody if they've got enough landscape and enough opportunity to do that. What's enough? That's really hard to put a number on, because it really depends on where it's located, how much space they have, what the forage types are. If they're in really dry areas, maybe it's only a few head. If they're in central, on the Big Island, the central area of the Big Island up around Waimea, the Waimea Plain, and their 60-inch rainfall zone, they're probably going to be able to support more animals than they would at, say, Waianae, where it's 8 or 9 inches of rainfall, maybe 2 times a year, pretty dry, and so so those are things that have to be considered.
Thank you so much, Mark and Clay. And please, Sanani has said in the chat, if you feel like you want to, and I know some of you are shy, please do turn those cameras on and unmute yourself if you're up for that. And we do have some amazing questions that are coming in. So Neil wants to know, Neil Fujii, aloha Neil. He would like to know, could grazing apply to areas that are not designated forage? For example, former sugarcane lands with undesirable ground cover and unfenced boundaries. That's a great question.
Well, I'll attempt a first try at this, Neil, and I would say, yeah, I think that I think there's a lot of this former sugarcane and pineapple land that is out there and now sitting fallow, that livestock grazing can be used to, one, reduce the fuel loads, but not just that, but to basically change the composition of the plants that are in those fallow fields. And right now, a lot of them are just trash. You know, the grasses that are growing up in there are not necessarily good forage grasses. There's a lot of shrub material. There's a lot of weeds in these fallow lands. And, you know, so and none of them are really contributing very much to those landscapes on an ecological basis, right? I mean, they're really not there, you know, supporting, you know, carbon sequestration in the soils. They're not really contributing to soil stability. You know, I guess they're protecting the soil a little bit, but, you know, there's really not much contribution there that we could gain from that. But if you could convert those into good grazing systems, you know, well-managed grazing systems can contribute carbon to the soil. You can also turn around and, you know, you're producing protein for sustaining communities and people. And so, you know, I think that all the way around, you can, you know, increase the value of that landscape on a social and level. So I think that, yeah, I think within this state, we have a lot of fallow lands that should be under grazing, and the grazing would change those fire regimes in those areas as well.
And thank you. Thank you, Mark and Shelley. Aina from Waikoloa Firewise would like to know, can the tool be used, or is it already used to overgraze in order to destroy the root mass of invasive grasses, basically to kill invasives for reforestation? That's a great question. Like, is it possible to get the animals in there into this not places that we don't want to keep them long term, because we do want to get rid of certain types of grass, and then move them into better places? Is that even a possibility, or is that not?
I don't know. I'll just add that I don't know if anyone's that's doing it, that have tried it. But, and Mark, I don't know what your thoughts are. I mean, obviously you'd have to be kind of ready to move, but I mean, maybe another question mark for you could be like, how long would it take to kind of hammer an area like that to get it ready if you wanted to do that?
Well, okay, so no, I don't know of anybody doing that using livestock to you know, basically overgraze an area. And yeah, it really makes me, you know, a little bit nervous when somebody says, let's just overgraze the crap out of some place so we can, you know, change the plant community. And because, you know, I think there are negative things that come with that overgrazing. You know, I mean, yeah, you know, I guarantee you could graze the grasses out of there. You would. It might take one or two cycles to, you know, but if you graze them down to nubs and you didn't allow them much recovery time, you know, that's the thing about grasses. I mean, the recovery time is really important for them to reestablish their root mass. So if that recovery time is too wide, you know, you're just gonna you'll slow the process down. I'm telling you how to do it now, but I'm going to tell you that's not something you want to do. I really don't. But you know, if you came in and you were on top of that grass every couple of weeks, I think after a season you would start to move those grasses would start to be eliminated from the plant community. The problem is that you're opening up the soil, and I'll guarantee you underneath all that grass are seeds from every kind of bad weed that you can imagine. Pomacani, blackberry, you name it, it's out there. Fireweed, all of these things are out there, and they're there. And right now, you know, in most places where you have good grass cover, all of those seeds, all of those weeds are pretty well suppressed. But as soon as you open that up and you just hammer the hell out of the grass and you expose that soil, all of those things are going to come up. Now, what are you going to do? Now you've got to have all kinds of chemicals, because you're not going to graze it away now, because these things are not palatable. Animals won't eat them. You know, they're thorny, they're toxic, they're, you know, they're unpalatable. Now you can't use animals to manage that landscape. So now you're going to have to come in with, you know, whatever tools that you can have. You're limited now to chemicals, maybe some brush control practices. You just change the landscape into something that from what you could manage to something that you can't manage. Yeah. And if you're moving away from the goal of establishing a forest, not to mention you've exposed the soil to soil erosion, either through wind or water. You've destabilized that soil. You're going to lose our soil organic matter. You know, there's all kinds of consequences there that are, you know, just a you know, a downfall of just a spiraling mess of problems that are going to arise from that. So yeah, you could do it.
Like from the restoration reforestation side, like a couple of thoughts. Like one is that, you know, you're very rarely going to be in a situation where you'll be, or I should say that there's few projects where that are able to kind of do the reforestation side of it at a scale that would match what you could do with the grazing, right? Like, so grazing is kind of effective again at these large scales, but restoration is typically on much smaller spatial scales. But also then to add to that is that what strategy that folks have been using, especially on the Big Island, is to work with the grasses, you know, because like Mark said, the grasses, they're predictable in that sense, you know, it grazed or not. And what they're doing instead of trying to like get rid of them all is actually put in bigger plants, right? So this is like the strategy at Hakalau Forest Reserve, where you just grow out your plants into gallon-sized pots, and then you can put them in and they'll actually overtop those grasses, right? So if you want to do reforestation, the strategy seems to be is you get those canopies, you can get those canopy trees above the grass, and then if you want to later go in and kind of try to deal with the grass, you can. And then again, you're going to be doing much more kind of fine scale control and removal, most likely.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both for outlining that, because you know what comes to mind for me is a place like Oahe that, you know, has been slowly converted, you know, like half acre by half acre into Hawaiian dryland forest from, you know, very nicely managed kikuyu grass, right? And so you're not, you know, necessarily just full on like you know, scorched earth thing with grazing the heck out of places, but it's like a slow conversion, you know, to which is take decades.
Soil loss is like, you do not want to lose your soil, right? That is the fundamental piece, whether you want to graze or you want to do reforestation. I mean, once you lose the soil, you're in a whole other world of trouble there.
Great. We also have, let's see here. Mark Hawking wants to know, where can silvopasture fit into the overall fuel management strategy? And some forested areas, for example, in Mono Road Fire, appear to have experienced a shift in fire behavior, maybe because lower wind speed and less herbaceous productivity in the understory. Where is the research in silvopasture systems? And for the layperson I need to know, what is silvopasture?
Well, yeah, silvopasture is basically combining a pasture system where there's grazing with a forest system. Usually, it can be for harvested forest trees, you know, like oak or koa or whatever, or it can be agroforestry related, where you're harvesting, you know, fruit crop from the trees. Think, you know, we could do something with mac nuts here, or we could do something with ulu here, or something like that, right? So we have a few silvopasture systems in Hawaii. They weren't really designed to be silvopasture, but they're used that way. And so we have people that are livestock producers that are grazing cattle under under the eucalyptus plantations, for example. Those eucalyptus plantations weren't planted with the idea of grazing underneath, but I think that over time people have figured out that, you know, the best way to manage the guinea grass underneath of the eucalyptus trees is to use grazing. And it's not happening everywhere, but it is a tool that can be used in those situations. I think, you know, personally, and just to, you know, just to kind of tie in a couple questions here, you know, I think that Hawaii has great potential for silvopasture systems. And in fact, I think that's probably one of the best ways that we could revitalize some of those former sugarcane and pineapple lands that are sitting fallow right now, is to develop a silvopasture system. Where we are either harvesting the wood or we are harvesting food from the trees that are grown in a pasture system. And so, you know, there are guidelines on how to plant the trees in a way that you don't totally shade out the grasses, so that you can maintain the pasture system. I mean, it is if you're talking silvopasture, you're talking about combining a forestry system with a grazing, pasture grazing system. And, you know, I think in terms of where we're at in Hawaii and you know, establishing good food security, bringing fires under control, maintaining and stabilizing the landscape and the soils that are under those landscapes, you know, preserving the ecology of those systems and managing the water that runs off of those systems. I mean, all kinds of social and ecological aspects are tied up in that. And I think that's one of the most significant ways that we could revitalize a lot of these fallow lands. And so, but that's saying nothing about the political will or the, you know, the fact that a lot of these lands are being saved up for, you know, are valued at a development value versus an agricultural value. But, you know, those are hurdles that would have to be overcome.
Yeah, I would just add too to that. Only thing I really would add is like to think that, you know, by kind of building capacity for those sorts of operations, right, that you also maintain, I think this goes back to actually a lot of the prior questions, is like you are working with a potential rancher that can maintain the capacity of maintaining those animals, having that herd to work with, right? So like if you want to do reforestation and mix it in with silvopasture, like any reforestation projects, and I think related to your comment, Matthew, is kind of like those, when we see these big fire events ripping across the grasslands, I think reforestation should be on our minds as a long-term solution. So this is like fuels conversion, right? Change into something that will be less likely to burn. But in the meantime, we need to manage the grasses alongside those projects, maybe within these projects, right? As like a silvopasture system would do. And then the bottom line too is we maintain the capacity and the knowledge on the ground of the folks that can actually know how to work with these animals. And so that's the biggest limitation we're finding on Oahu, is like, we got people that want to do animals starting in Waianae and they've got like 10 sheep, right? And they're not going to cover a lot of ground with those. And we don't have, well, we do, but it's just that it's limited as far as the people who actually have the know-how and have the herds to deal with the fuels that we have. So I think any project, the silvopasture has a lot of potential, as Mark was saying. It's kind of, and I know, you know, they're doing it, like Haleakala is a great example. It's not in the context of fire management, but they are working with these mixed COA and be able to use the animals to kind of manage the trees, right?
So I actually have some small scale trials going on with silvopasture systems, working with a few of the ranches, just to look at different management practices, different grazing management practices, and then sort of looking at the impacts on the forages and on the soils and those kinds of things. So there is a little bit of work going on, and you know, currently, and I'll just point out that really you know, a lot of our systems right now have not been designed silvopasture systems, or sort of adopted silvopasture systems. You know, with a lot, you know, they planted a lot of the eucalyptus trees, you know, over on the islands, on the Big Island, without, you know, really planning for grazing. But people are grazing under them. And so, now we're looking at, sort of the impacts of that. And, sort of the consequences of that. But at the same time, I think it will get some answers about how to design areas for Hawaii. What's the tree spacing? How do we space the trees? Do we do it in rows? Do we do it on a grid? Things like that, where, just trying to balance between, the harvestable tree products versus the harvestable landscape for the animal production.
Just such great information, and just wonderful to hear. But there is one last question just in the chat, and I'd love to hear from others too, about deer populations as compared to quote unquote livestock fuels management. Are they too unpredictable? Are they overly destructive? Thoughts? Maybe some of our ranchers out there, Harvey, others maybe who know about this, who've worked with these animals, can talk about it too. Jump in.
I'll start off the comments, just because I've worked with a lot of ranchers that are dealing with, the deer populations on Molokai and Maui. And, my instincts are, for the first thing is that the deer populations are unpredictable and they're extremely destructive. And then you add their grazing pressure on top of what the ranch needs for their livestock. And it's just too big of a challenge. That the ranches they're already cutting back their herd sizes by 30 and 40% just to adjust to the number of deer, and the deer populations aren't slowing down. And so, the deer come in and they completely wipe out an area. They don't have a sense of take half, leave half, or leaving 50% or 30%. They just eat it to the ground. There's too many of them. And you can't control them. They're just going to graze where they're going to graze. And so they're going to graze in those, as Clay pointed out in the study that he pointed out, they're going to graze in those areas where the forage is good, and they're not going to graze in those areas where you have high fuel loads, where they're dry and the fuels are basically a tinderbox. So I think, the deer are not a solution to the situation on Maui. They're a problem, and they're a problem that has to be brought under control. Livestock management is that. It's managed grazing. It can be targeted. It can be controlled as to the utilization levels, or the fuel load removal, if you will. And so that is the solution. And having livestock producers being a part of that whole process is extremely important.
Yeah, and the deer add all other dimension. Like they jump fences, right? They're like beyond what are kind of the current technologies that are being imposed to manage livestock in here. They even up in the mountains, right? Like they use hog wire and things like that. That you need like 9-foot fencing to keep these things out. So it's a kind of whole other dimension of management challenges that the deer introduce. There was another one.
I think Harvey, were you going to say something? I feel like
please.
maybe you were going to unmute. not to put you on the spot. But I am.
Well, I'm in a resort condominium at the west end of Molokai, and I can tell you that the deer wipe us out, and we found no way to control them. I agree, if you have a 9-foot fence, it's going to keep them out, but who wants a 9-foot fence? And they're just everywhere. I know that at night I have to drive at 15 miles an hour because there are just so many deer everywhere. And they don't just come with ones and twos, they come in the hundreds. And I don't know where they're getting their food or what have you, but they're, you can go along and see nothing happening. And then all of a sudden there are deer just flying across the road, and we'll be tight if you're in the way.
Yeah, thank you so much for that perspective. You can speak to it firsthand. Gosh, this is such a great conversation. We want to keep it going. We're actually here, but I do want to tell everyone we would love to do a part 2 and have Clay, and others answer your, this is a bad pun, burning questions about animals.
There's
And
so
so,
many, there's so
since
many bad fire puns.
I know, and so, Nani, if you're there, if you can put that link in for our 30-second survey, we do want to make sure if you please keep that open and give us your email if you would, because otherwise we can't get in touch with you for future conversations about grazing. There it is. There it is in the bottom there on the chat. So, or if you want to just stick your email into the chat directly, you're welcome to do that. Other questions? I feel like I've lost track.
I was going to add, Mark answered one of Amanda's questions. She was a question about how the trees are protected. And I would just add that there's good data out there on for koa, at least, like what size they can reach before they're not as prone to being knocked over and damaged by the cattle. So usually, yeah, it's like you have to protect them until they reach a certain size, and then they're all right. And there's other stuff. So there, I mean, could mention this too, but it wasn't all that successful. But Mark and I supervised a student who was trying to do a grazing aversion study. So there actually are methods to try to train livestock to avoid certain types of, so he was working with goats to see if he could train them to avoid eating koa. But it was hard to do because you can get them trained, but then all of a sudden one of them forgets and figures it out, and they all see that one eating, like, all right, let's go. So it wasn't all that successful, but there are methods out there to try, and they've done some. I mean, Mark, you're way more well versed in this than I am, but they've done this with sort of poisonous weeds and things in the mainland. They can actually train livestock.
Yeah, I mean they've used aversion training for grazing goats in vineyards and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, and it can be successful, but you gotta continually keep the training going on the animals. Like Clay pointed out, if one figures it out, they're all going to figure it out eventually. So, they well, anyway, and it does depend on the type of animal that you're grazing as well. So goats are much more of a browse species, so they will tend to try to nibble on woody plants. And so if you do have a type of forest or a tree in your silvopasture system that is fairly palatable to goats, then they'll probably gnaw on it a bit, and even bark it even when it's an older tree. Not that we use albizia for a forest product or a silvopasture tree, but as an example, goats and they'll bark a live, fully grown, mature albizia tree and kill it, because the bark is photosynthetic, and so they can kill it, and so that's not what you want for your silvopasture system. So it depends on the type of animals that you're going to be grazing and the type of tree that you're going to be having in that system. But there are like Clay said, there are guidelines for various ones and all of those kinds of things. So
Other questions out there?
We got them all in the chat.
I think we did. Well, it's officially 12:01. This has been amazing. You guys have been incredible. Thank you all so much for joining. Again, if you don't mind that 10-second survey, tell us how we did this time. We'd love to know what you liked, what you didn't like, what you need, what you want to hear more of, topics you might want to hear in the future. Just stay in touch with us. And again, if you want to put your email in there, we can contact you later. We can do a follow-up here. It's been wonderful. Thank you guys so much, everyone, for joining us. And if there aren't any other questions, which I'm not hearing, we'll see you the next time.
Thanks, everybody.
thank you, everybody. Have a good day.